This is not going to hold unless Ukraine and its security aspirations are part of the picture. And right now, there's no real lasting security guarantee. Yesterday, we saw Steve Witkoff kind of writing something on the back of a napkin on the Sunday shows. That's not going to hold water. So this is a very complicated problem, but it's also a domestic problem, Mike. So Zelensky is going to have to sell this to his people. He's going to have to convince millions of Ukrainians to stand down. And right now, what's been offered is certainly not good enough.
Now, on the question of the security guarantees, is there a version of this that really would be acceptable to both Ukraine and Russia? There does seem to be a gulf. The whole question of NATO membership and the idea of NATO support for Ukraine has been anathema to Vladimir Putin really from day one. He claims it as really an origin cause for his decision to invade the country back in 2022. And yet what we're hearing from Steve Witkoff sure sounds Article 5-like. So how does what the U.S. puts together as a security guarantee together with Europe emerge as something that's palatable for both sides?
That's the big question we're going to be talking about at the White House today. So I think it involves boots on the ground from the French and from the British, and we'll see what the Germans are willing to do. I don't think they're willing to do that, but Britain and France have talked about putting boots on the ground. We need to see what that would look like. I don't think that's going to assure the Ukrainians. You have to remember, Ukrainians have a long, painful history with this. In 1994, they gave up their nuclear arsenal with security guarantees from the United States, from Britain, and from Russia. And it was all for nothing. And the Ukrainians remember this. You have a conversation with any Ukrainian, and they will say, we remember the Budapest Memorandum. So Ukrainians are unwilling to give up any kind of land swap. It's not going to happen today. I think what we're going to see today is damage control. So President Trump many things can be said about him, but he always remembers the last conversation he has, and he's very influenced by the last person he spoke with. So I think we see 7 European leaders in the White House today trying to pull him back. He's accepted Putin's narrative. That's what we saw in Anchorage, just to get to the point. He accepted that, no, we're not going to do a ceasefire. We're going to go straight to a peace agreement. And he's saying today it's up to Ukraine to end the war. That's nonsense. Ukraine started the war, and Russia is the only one that can stop it. Russia has to go home. Russia has to give something. So I think what I'm watching for today is, will the Europeans be able to say, Donald Trump, hello, Russia is not as strong as you say. Its economy is doing pretty badly. All the military assessments that the British government just put one out, and it says it'll take years for the Russians to take those 5 oblasts that it wants to occupy and another 1 million soldiers. The Russians are not in great shakes today. So I think that's what Europe is trying to do. And it's also there to remind him of the stakes. You know, they need the United States for these security guarantees, but if they can't get a deal, Europe is really going to have to. It's really going to have to carry its own weight, and that's pretty scary.
Yep.
Well, if you're watching us on YouTube, streaming us, our radio listeners, we're now seeing Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni enter into the White House. Her car rolled in to the South Lawn, flanked with Italian flags, as we keep seeing these leaders rolling in for these negotiations. And Melinda, I want to pick up on something that you were just discussing when it comes to territory. Can you talk to us about how critical the eastern southern parts of Ukraine, we're talking about the Donbass region. Our reporting indicates that President Trump had relayed to allies that Putin wants Ukraine to seek control of that territory, even though Russia doesn't have military control of it. Why is this area such a friction point in these talks?
Sure, it's a great question. So we don't know the details, but what has been leaked out of Anchorage is this. Putin wants 5 oblasts. These are regions of Ukraine. And the Russians already occupy the northern oblast. It's called Luhansk. The next one down is called Donetsk, and that one's really crucial. The Russians occupy a good chunk of it, 87%. But the Ukrainians have really dug in there, and they have many cities that are called fortress cities. And they are heavily defended, and they are key to Ukraine's success. So they have to stay there. They're not just going to walk away from that. And then Putin allegedly wants to freeze the line in Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast, and they want Crimea legally recognized. If you remember, back in 2014, Russia illegally invaded Crimea and had a bogus referendum. And it says that Crimea is it's ours, but the international community doesn't recognize it as such. So if Zelensky walks into the White House and says, okay, uncle, I give, this has enormous implications for the world order. It means might makes right. It means that the Chinese are licking their lips and saying, oh, baby, it's time for Taiwan. I mean, this would undo the order that was established after World War II, and it would consign 43 million, you get 37 million Ukrainians up to a fate. They didn't do anything wrong. This is not the American order that we've defended since World War II.
And this puts an enormous amount of pressure on Volodymyr Zelenskiy as he walks into the Oval Office today. And we're thinking back to that first meeting, which, as we all remember, really went in a very different direction than Ukraine would have wanted. What is the Ukrainian president's ask, and what is his goal today as he heads in?
I think the word you're looking for is disaster. That meeting was awful, and no one wants to repeat that. So I think Volodymyr Zelenskiy is a showman. He's extremely articulate, but he has a short temper, and he has to be very careful. J.D. Vance is going to be in the room, and J.D. Vance is going to poke him and try to anger him again. And so he's got to defend Ukraine's interests. He's got to keep his cool, but he also has, he has the Italian prime minister there to help him. My eyes on Mark Rutte, though. Mark Rutte is NATO Secretary General. He's got Trump's number. He knows how to flatter him, and I think he's going to help Zelensky. So when it gets heated, I expect the Europeans to pull back and turn down the temperature. But the job today is there's not going to be a land swap. We're not going to be having this discussion at the end of the day. Mark my words. We're going to be talking about they're going to go back to a ceasefire agreement and security guarantees. The other thing that I think Zelensky will talk about is justice. There was no talk about justice in Anchorage. So Russia has kidnapped more than 19,400 Ukrainian children. It's taken them, it's given them new names and new identities. Those children have to be returned. That was not talked about. There are so many war crimes. There are rapes. These things have to be addressed, and they haven't been talked about at all.
And we did see First Lady Melania Trump write a letter over the weekend that touched on this idea that you're talking about these children that were taken from Ukraine. I do want to go back and pull on your expertise on something that you were just talking about. When you were mentioning the Vice President J.D. Vance, we just had this conversation with Jordan Fabian earlier in the hour, this idea that he had been a pretty staunch opponent of additional aid to Ukraine. Could you give us just a little bit of background here about how we got to this point when it does come to U.S. support in Ukraine, the type of support that we have given up to this point when it comes to additional military assistance?
So the United States has been the big player. And the last big package that the United States authorized was in April of 2024. And at this point, it doesn't look like this Congress is going to authorize another package. Never say never. There's a bill that Jean Shaheen and Murkowski just put in place that would authorize additional monies. But at this point, I don't think it's going to happen. So the United States is a massive player, but Europe has had to step up to the plate. And there's more than one way to give. There's military assistance, there's financial assistance, and the U.S. has been part of that. Europe's been a bigger player on that as well. But we also provide intelligence sharing, and that intelligence sharing has been key. So the two things that I'm watching for, to cut to the chase, the United States must supply intelligence sharing. That's absolutely crucial to keep the war effort going. And the other thing that the Trump administration just authorized is a deal. So this is through NATO, and Western European countries have a $1.5 billion deal where they can buy weapons from the United States. It's mostly Patriots, it's air defense. And our Patriot systems are really special because they can take out ballistic missiles. These are the missiles that are killing children at night, that are hitting hospitals. So Europe is buying our weapons and sending them to Ukraine. So at the end of the day, if Donald Trump it keeps on the intelligence sharing and he continues to allow Europe to buy U.S. weapons, I'm going to be pretty happy.
Do you see any prospect of Vladimir Putin taking whatever emerges from today's discussions and actually buying into it and accepting it? What is the incentive for him to actually stop prosecuting this war in Ukraine, which is now well into 3.5 years?
Putin, he's got no incentive. Mike, he thinks he's winning, and he's been making small incremental progress. This has not been a great year for him, but he's all in. He bet his presidency on it. He's not going anywhere.
And you talked about the Russian economy, though, and how much it has suffered as a result. Have the sanctions really had that kind of effect, and are they having the result? There's a difference between the effect on the economy and the actual political result. Would further sanctions even work at this point?
So do sanctions change behavior? No, they've not changed Russian behavior, right? Just to cut to the chase. But there's many more things we can do. And if President Trump or his team is listening, I just got to say, enforce what you got, baby. You got some good sanctions there, but make sure the Department of Treasury is enforcing. And do the things that you've threatened to do. There's another bill right now, Lindsey Graham's bill, that would increase the sanctions by 500%. He could also increase secondary sanctions on China. President Trump has a lot of options. He actually holds the cards. He could change Russia's behavior, but you can't just do it through sanctions. Sanctions are not enough. You also have to supply the Ukrainians with the military might to defend their territory.
As we've been talking, we did just see the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, arrive at the White House. If you're keeping track with us, we've so far seen the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and also the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. We are still waiting on the French President Emmanuel Macron as these leaders come to the White House for those discussions today to lend their support to Ukraine. Picking up on what we were just talking about, you mentioned so-called secondary sanctions, and we heard President Trump over the weekend say that he's not looking to up those tariffs, so-called secondary tariffs. There's some different wording being thrown around here. But tariffs, we've seen so-called secondary tariffs ramped up on India, for example, over their imports of Russian energy supplies. President Trump says that for now he's going to hold off on doing that for China. And he said that it's because he made progress with his talks with Putin. I'd love your geopolitical perspective here. How much of a factor is actually China when it comes to the future of the war in Ukraine?
Huge. So both Russia and Ukraine have been getting their drones from China, but Russia relies on China and on North Korea to keep its war machine going. It cannot prosecute the war without the Chinese. But in President Trump's mind, he started with the Indians, and that was supposed to be a sign to the Chinese that you're next. If you don't fall in line, you're next. But we don't see really any action on that. President Trump likes to threaten sanctions, and then he backs off. Even he had threatened much harsher sanctions, and then he just sort of gives. One other point that I think that's worth bringing into this discussion is that if we do get to a land swap today and they break out the maps and they start talking about giving up territory, it's not Donald Trump's territory to give away. And U.S. law, the sanctions prohibit him from giving any Ukrainian territory away. Congress would have to authorize it, but even more so, Ukrainians would have to hold a referendum. So this whole talk, we're all getting, I think, agitated because of what Putin was suggesting up in Anchorage. But the bottom line is Putin is trying to kick the can down the road. He wants to continue the war to go on. There are no consequences, right? Mm-hmm. He bought himself more time in Anchorage. That's what Anchorage was about. He got a red carpet treatment, and he was treated like a major head of state. And he is according to the International Criminal Court, he's a wanted war criminal.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to Ukraine, though, it is not up to the U.S. to decide the
Correct.
fate of those territories. But what is Ukraine's view? At some point, would they say, hey, look, we've had enough, and we may just have to recognize a redrawing of borders to simply spare us from more bloodshed? Or how close are we to that point? Will Volodymyr Zelenskiy say, look, that is a red line still? We are, and he has made clear in his most recent comments that that's the case, but behind closed doors, will there be perhaps a different tune?
No, there will not be another tune. That is an absolute red line. Until there are real security guarantees, there's not going to be a discussion. And I think it's worth pointing out, yesterday Rubio said there has to be, both sides have to give. What have the Russians given? Have the Russians given any territory back? Are they offering any territory? Are they conceding anything? The Russians haven't offered anything in return.
So part of the security guarantees that we had originally heard, and we were talking about this earlier, is this idea that the U.S. kept saying that security guarantees were implicit. The U.S. had a vested economic interest after signing that economic cooperation, the so-called critical minerals deal. Where does that stand now, Melinda? Is that already in effect? How is that playing into these discussions, if at all?
It's not playing into the discussions. It's a great question, but the critical minerals deal, we're years away from that. So unfortunately, I think that was more of a theoretical argument that it would provide some kind of safety assurance to investors. We still see rocket and missile attacks every single night. You know, the month of July had a 798% increase in 2025 over 2024. I did the math. There were 5,208 rocket and drone strikes this year, and the previous year the figure, was a fraction of that.
Mm-hmm. What was the logic, in closing, of skipping over this ceasefire step, if there was any at all? Is it really just about getting to a grand bargain, a grand deal faster?
So it is Vladimir Putin's strongest desire to go straight to the peace agreement. He can continue the war, and it is unlikely that we're going to get a peace agreement. This is a really thorny issue. I think it's worth, and this is not me being partisan at all, but you can't spend 3 hours in discussions about an issue that is this complicated and expect both sides to come to an agreement. They didn't do their homework in Anchorage. We're nowhere near a peace deal, unfortunately.